as we start this session today, I would like to take this opportunity to request our speakers to introduce themselves. Maybe shall we start with Dr. Thomspon?
Hi, I'm Nathan Thompson. I work for Assessment Systems Corporation in the US. My background is in adaptive testing. So rather than work in a specific area of psychometric testing with content expertise like HR, I work across all areas of psychometric testing, whether it's education or HR or professional skill certification or military testing, medical testing. I provide software in all those fields.
Dr. Duggal, shall we have your introduction, please?
Sure. So good evening, everybody. I'm Dr. Shalini Duggal. I have a background in psychology. I've specialized in the areas of positive psychology and cultural psychology. I have about 17 years of work experience in the corporate sector, and I've worked across areas related to organization development and people development. I've worked fairly extensively in the area of psychometrics, both from an application of tools perspective as well as a development of tools perspective. And I'm very excited to be a part of this conversation.
Dr. Sangale?
Yeah, so I'm Dr. Vishal Sangale. I'm the co-founder of Brainberg. Basically, I'm a homeopathic physician and a psychologist. So I've been working in this space for the past 10 years. And over a period of time, I've been working with organizations and educational institutes as well to cater to the needs of psychometric assessments. I look forward for a very fruitful engagement in this session this evening.
Thank you, panelists, for bringing such a vast and varied, expertise on the board, and really excited to hear from all of you. A quick introduction about myself. I'm Dr. Anamika Sharma, an IO psychologist by training and a psychometrician with over 20 years of experience. And right now, the founder of Sci-Fi People Consulting and Advisory Services. And prior to that, I had been a chief psychometrician for Mercer Metal, an assessment company, for over 6 years. I thoroughly enjoy my work in a sense, in the field of right from delivering end-to-end solutions, right from assessments to intervention programs in the organizations. Okay, before we start the webinar today, few hygiene health checks that I would like all of us to observe. As the topic of the webinar, we'll try and cover all the possible topics related to the subject. We'll certainly really promise you to hold more webinars to address pertinent questions related to data modeling, because we have received a lot of questions around data modeling as well. So if we are not able to cover it in today's session, we'll definitely hold another webinar to take care of that. If you think that your question is not getting addressed here, so maybe you can mark your question in the chat, and we'll take up the question at the end of the session. And please request all of you to keep your mics on mute all the time, so that we can run a smooth session here. Yeah. So as we all know, the key to a productive and a successful organization is an effective team, irrespective of the size of the organization or the industry. Various factors impact an organization's ability to be productive, including motivation, leadership skills, engagement, or the quality of workforce indeed. The productivity of the company automatically spikes up when the workforce is motivated enough and is efficient, and to achieve it, it becomes imperative that we select the right set of candidates, ensure their engagement in the changing work dynamics with distributed workforce, as is the current scenario, and help them sustain their mental well-being and psychological safety all the time. A lot of our participants are keen to understand what psychometric properties ensure that the psychometric test that they are using is able to predict the behavior at workplace. So my first question to our speakers is to help us understand what are psychometric tests and how do we know it is a good test or a relevant test. It would be a good idea to get some perspectives on the reliability and validity of the psychometric test in the changing business scenario. Dr. Thomspon, would you like to go first?
Sure. Thank you, Anamika. So when I talk about psychometric tests, I like to use a word that I saw once, and that is psychoeducational. So that it's referring to psychoeducational variables, which can be psychological in nature, which is a pretty wide range, as well as educational in nature, which is a pretty wide range. These, of course, can be used in many different types of research and areas in the workforce. So it's not just limited to employment testing. You know, a lot of times we think of psychometric testing and we immediately think of selection for employment or job applicants, but that's not necessarily the case. In fact, in many countries, the word psychometrics is not used to refer to psychometric testing, but rather to the study of measurement itself. When you're studying methodological issues like item response theory or adaptive testing algorithms, they refer to those as psychometrics. In terms of how to select one, she mentioned reliability and validity. Those are the two most important things to look at, of course. The modern conceptualization of validity has 5 different pillars or 5 different aspects, one of which is statistical information about the performance of the test, which of course then includes reliability. But those of you who are newer to the topic of psychometric testing should know that there's a new modern test theory that's called item response theory. It's sometimes just called modern test theory as a plain title. That no longer uses the concept of reliability, though it uses a new concept called precision, or information, or standard error. There's different ways that they term it, but that approach doesn't use reliability, so that if you were to look for documentation and try to choose one of those tests, it's not going to mention reliability. On the other hand, if you're using a classically derived test, having reliability is really important. And when you're trying to select one, like we're talking about, how do you select whether it's a good one? The key thing is to ask for documentation. A good psychometric test will have some sort of technical report that will say, you know, we designed the test this way. We sampled it with a norm sample from these countries or these types of professions or so on. And we validated against this use for these professions. We have these statistics and all of the questions that make sure that they're high quality. There's a lot of documentation like that. As to how to go through that documentation, that's an entire graduate course. But that's the first thing that you should be looking for. Anamika?
Okay. Yeah. Dr. Duggal, what's your perspective on this, and what can be some of the basic psychometric properties required for performance-based assessments in organizations?
Sure. Thank you for the question, Dr. Sharma. As Dr. Thomspon said, it's very important to focus on the significant aspects of reliability and validity of tests. So those are really the kind of foundation stones of determining whether a test is a good test or not. But when it comes to performance-based tests, it may be relevant to keep in mind a few additional aspects. For example, is the test job relevant, or does the test measure one or more skills that are important to the job? So that's one important aspect. Additionally, can by using the test, more effective employment decisions be made about individuals? So for example, does the test measure, for example, say coding skills, and does that help us make a better selection decision about a job that requires those kind of skills? Also, it may be important to focus on the kind of reliability or validity that is getting reported or getting established. For example, for a test-retest reliability, which indicates the likelihood of getting a similar score after a period of time, and also about the stability of the construct or the skill itself. So, however, some skills or some constructs are more stable over time. So, for example, an individual's reading ability may be more stable over a period of time as compared to, say, a person's anxiety level, which could be more variable, especially over a test-retest reliability kind of a perspective. So the test-retest reliability may be more valid for more, a better measure for a reading ability test, and maybe for an anxiety-based questionnaire, maybe a measure of internal consistency could be a better measure to look at. Similarly, for validity, criterion reference measures that look at predictive outcomes could be a good measure to consider. A test validity is established in reference to a specific purpose, and the test may not be valid for all purposes. So, for example, a test which is about making predictions about someone's technical proficiency will not be a good measure for somebody's leadership ability. So it's very important to keep in mind what is the relevant criterion being considered while establishing reliability. The third aspect to consider is the norm group or the reference group, which is used to establish these aspects. The greater the similarity between the target group and our norm group, the greater the chances of more predictive outcomes. So while the norm group and the target group do not have to have an exact match, but the more similar they are, the greater the outcomes or the better the outcomes are likely to be. So three things that need to be paid attention to while looking at a performance-based tool: the kind of reliability being studied, the kind of validity, and the nature of the reference.
Thanks, Dr. Duggal, for your inputs. So as a follow-up question, it becomes quite imperative for the participants to know why is it critical to use psychometric assessments in the changing work dynamics. Dr. Sangale, what's your opinion on this? It will be good to have some examples from your vast industry experience.
Thank you, Anamika. So organizations these days need to know their employees before recruitment, maybe advancement through their career, or certain other activities through their employee life cycle. So good amount of research points out to that, like over 60% of organizations go for some kind of job skill tests. These are not necessarily the psychometric tests, but over 20 to 30% of these tests roughly are psychometric in nature, either personality or cognitive test. The good point here is psychometric test, provides a better chance for the organizations to succeed in their endeavor. They have a better predictive index attached to it. So it becomes critical for the organizations to adapt to the practices of psychometric testings for their employees. Now, there are several psychometric tests available that can be used in different settings for an organizations. Typically, if you see two broader areas, these can be, the recruitment area or the training and development area. A good use case could be to identify training need of the employees, which necessarily will have three broader questions to address. One, which employees or who needs the training, first of all, and then why the training is necessary at the first part, and then what kind of training is needed to be imparted. So all these things can be addressed through a very specific deployment of a psychometric test into the organization. So I believe this becomes a very interesting part as far as the value attached to it, while the outcome serves for a better chance for improvement of the organization's success. Yeah.
Thanks, Vishal. Shalini, based on your experience, can you suggest how can psychometric testing aid in managing distributed workforce and monitoring the behavior of the teams remotely, engaging with the teams in a more effective and an objective way? Also, it will be interesting to know how the need of psychometric assessments have increased post-COVID, or is it seen as a superfluous in the labor market? Your thoughts on this, Shalini?
Sure. So, since we've kind of just sort of, entered the post-COVID world, or the time period has been relatively short. So many of the trends are now kind of beginning to come in, or will kind of get established as sort of a new normal gets established. Now, the new normal in the post-COVID world will be very different from what we've experienced in the past. So, aspects of work from home, role of AI, role of automation will get extremely highlighted in this kind of a setting. Also, it's important to keep in mind that, while many sectors are not doing so well, or, some sectors are even going bust in the current times, some sectors are doing increasingly well, or they are booming. So, for example, ed tech or e-retail are sectors which are, sort of doing well in this kind of a setting. You may have seen a lot of advertisements on prime time, Indian news for many edtech companies, which was not really sort of so common till a few months ago, but now it's quite common. So now in this new normal, some of the aspects that could become supremely important are those of trust and flexibility. While the concept of a distributed workforce is not new in itself, but the manner in which it's playing out now, and also the scale at which it is operational now, is very different, with so many people managing both home-related aspects and work-related aspects at the same time. Also aspects around anxiety, resilience, optimism, ability to handle anxiety, aspects of learning agility, all are important in this time. Even from a functional skills perspective, new skills related to AI automation, they become increasingly relevant as this new normal kind of sets in. The role of psychometrics in assessing these aspects of aptitude, behavioral, and domain-specific skills will also accordingly become significant as we go along this period. Also, say, when you talk about succession planning, especially in the time of crisis, is an important aspect. Psychometric tools, which are part of a larger assessment center or a larger assessment portfolio that could help in identifying high potentials or replacements, would play an important role. Keeping in mind the more relevant behavioral and functional skills that become important right now.
Thanks, Shalini, for the insights.
Sure.
As we all know that every process comes up with its own challenges, and psychometric testing is not an exception. One of the pertinent questions posted by a lot of our participants was that what can be the administrative challenges in a virtual and a distributed working environment, and how can we ensure data security and transparency in remote virtual testing? Nathan, would you like to address this question?
Sure, thank you, Anamika. Yeah,
it would be a good idea, Nathan, if you can also, throw some light on how online proctored shortened examination works.
Okay, thank you. Yeah, to first follow up with that, as Dr. Duggal was saying, the dynamics are changing a lot, even though the specifics might not be. So there's different parts of the area that are booming and other parts of the area that are not. So there's going to be more applicants in some areas, less applicants in some areas. And in some cases, the world has not changed very much. Like there will still be some testing from home with verification testing as part of a job selection process. Because, that was mostly tested from home before, so now it'll still be mostly tested from home. In some cases, it'll be quite different where we're now implementing remote proctoring. And that's especially the case for higher stakes exams where you don't have the verification test. So verification test for some of you is where you might have 1,000 people take a psychometric test online at home to apply for a job, and maybe the top 20 are considered candidates, and then they take a verification test when they come to some sort of training system or interviews, so that you would only see those 20 out of 1,000 anyways. But in higher stakes exams like professional skills certification or university admissions or things like that, remote proctoring is going to become even more important now. And that is actually one of the areas of the economy that's booming now, is remote proctoring. You can imagine how much more business those types of companies are doing right now. And when it comes to remote proctoring, there's two things to pay attention to. The first is the computer or exam aspect, and the second is to the human and environment aspect. The computer and exam aspect is controlled by the testing platform. And this hasn't really changed since before COVID. So we're talking about having an online testing platform, that has, let's say, some randomization or adaptive testing algorithms to make it more secure. And it locks down the computer while the students are taking the test. And it provides a good quality assessment that has, high predictive validity, that sort of thing. You can imagine that that aspect hasn't really changed since before COVID. And then the human environment aspect, this is where the remote proctoring companies come into play and are facing a lot of challenges and trying to scale and deal with some of the COVID situation. And that human environment aspect starts by verifying the person's identity. So you have to be able to, take a picture of their ID card, verify it's the right person, and don't let them start the test until you verify that it's the right person. Of course, this can be difficult to do with an algorithm, so usually that's done with a human, which then presents a scalability problem. The next step is to make sure that you're secure the environment. So what they often do is require the use of a cell phone as an additional camera. So they have ways to get your cell phone using the video camera to link up on the computer. And they'll ask you to, take pictures underneath your desk or on the side, and then they'll ask you to put your cell phone, let's say something like that, those you can see my video, so that it has a view of the space or a view of the environment. And that was a really strong or advancement in the field of remote proctoring, which only happened like, maybe 2 years ago. So it's useful that we have that as we go into the COVID world. And on top of that, we're still trying to maintain integrity. And I always say test integrity and test security are scalable. They're on a sliding scale. On one end, you've got, let's say, formative assessments for your school kids, where you got to have some security to make sure that they, taking the right test at the end of the first grade. And on the other end, you've got, let's say, medical licensure exams for doctors or lawyers that are, you still want to have really, really high security for those, but we still can't go to test centers because they're closed. And then there's everything in between. So it's important for you as a consumer to think about where you fall on that scale and what are the aspects of security that are important to you to maintain validity.
Thanks, Nathan. Vishal, what's your take on this question?
So in addition to what Nathan has put it rightly about various aspects of the remote proctoring things, we live in an age of data, and there's modern organizations, data is being consumed and generated at a very unprecedented levels, frequently exchanged between multiple individuals, systems, and processes. I believe data integrity has become a major institutional challenge in big data analytics, where the decision making is increasingly based on that. So to guarantee the security and the data integrity, organizations need to establish a strong quality management practices that will help them protect the data right from the source, while they collect the data and while they process it or while they store it. So that is very, very essential part, and some of the measures that Nathan has put it rightly into what all things can be done are critical for the integrity from the integrity perspective or the security perspective.
Thanks, Vishal. This is quite informative. Obviously, the next question that emerges, keeping in mind the changing work dynamics, is that does the reliability of psychometric tests change with uncertainty? Situations like pandemic or something which is impacting everybody globally. Shalini, what's your perspective on this? And it will be great if you can share some examples so that the participants are able to relate to it better.
Sure. Thanks, Dr. Sharma. So my take on this is that the reliability of a test takes into account an aspect of the standard error of measurement. The smaller the standard error of measurement, the higher the reliability. Now, one of the aspects of SEM, or the standard error of measurement, is handling or accounting for user anxiety, especially in cases where reliability is established using a parallel form or a test retest method. User anxiety or other variables related to the user aspect may already be accounted for while reporting these reliability estimates. This would also hold true of different testing environments that are accounted for during reliability estimates. And in this case, it could be, say, a work environment or an office environment versus a home environment for many of these tests now. So the overall reliability may not get impacted much. However, if the fundamental construct getting assessed is impacted, then the validity may need to be reconsidered. So, for example, in case of criterion referenced validity, which uses predictive worked outcomes, we may need to relook at the criterion itself. So an example of this is, say for a sales role, if the earlier performance-based criterion may have been an ability to negotiate in a face-to-face setting, for example. And that's how we kind of establish the validity of this tool by using that kind of a predictive criterion. But now the criterion may itself change, to the ability to negotiate over a virtual platform. And that could require some degree of, say, different skills or a different skill set. Or say, for example, for a planning skills kind of a tool or a tool that looked at, how organized or structured or planned a person is. the planning reference criterion may have taken into account planning in a very different format than say what planning in a remote way of working entails. So we may need to keep these aspects in mind. So in my opinion, while the reliability may not be impacted much because it's already taking into account a lot of variable factors, while saying that there is a consistency when a tool is applied once and when the tool is kind of applied again. So there's a consistency there and it's taking into account those factors. The validity may still need to be kind of relooked at.
I totally second you, Shalini. Nathan, would you like to share some examples based on your global experience?
Sure. I think there's, like I said earlier, a lot of situations, there's going to still be a lot of validity and reliability around exams, and they're not going to change substantially. Some of the examples that are going to change substantially are the high stakes certification and licensure exams that used to be delivered in proctored test centers. So you got large companies like Pearson VUE or Psychometric that had test centers around the world. And you would go to take a medical exam at them, or in some cases something like the GMAT or higher stakes educational exam. And of course, all of those test centers are currently shut down. So those kinds of organizations are scrambling either to figure out how not to deliver the test for 6 months, or to figure out a new way to deliver the test under completely different conditions. And it was a huge situation for some of those organizations. And even the providers are sometimes facing difficulties like that. Examity is a major US provider of remote proctoring, and they provide live proctoring services. And those live proctoring services were provided by an office in India. So when the lockdown happened in India, that office was shut down, and this large company was no longer able to provide live proctoring services, which of course impacted the validity of assessments for their clients. So we are going to see, some changes like that are not just affecting the consumers, but also affecting the vendors, which can substantially affect both the business processes and the validity of the exam.
Thanks, Nathan. I think it's quite insightful for the participants to know, how, what is the difference exactly between one understand in a better manner, what's exactly the difference between reliability and validity, and in what situation reliability gets impacted or not impacted. And similarly, the same applies to the validity as well. Thanks, Shalini and Nathan, for the insights. A lot of our participants have shown interest in knowing what can be the probable use cases during and post-COVID business scenario. Nathan, would you like to take up this question first?
Sure. The post-COVID validity?
So the question is around what can be the probable use cases of psychometric assessments during and post-COVID business scenario.
Okay, I gotcha. So it's the prevalent cases are where we need to provide either predictive validity or incremental predictive validity across other types of situations.
Exactly.
And these are going to change in the COVID and post-COVID world, as was said earlier, I think by Dr. Duggal, in that the variables that can predict success might be quite different now than they have in the past. So we're talking about resilience, being able to stay on task, being able to work from home effectively, manage distractions. There's different types of psychological variables that now might provide better predictive validity for, screening job applicants. So I think one of the greater uses, more prevalent uses of psychometric tests in the post-COVID world will be shifting towards these things. And, instead of being able to, effectively hold in-person meetings and some of the other things that were more important in the pre-COVID world, some of those skills are going to be much less important in the post-COVID world. And we're going to see new types of tests, psychometric tests, come out in the marketplace that are going to be marketed towards post-COVID or during COVID constructs or things that you're trying to measure. So I think it'll be important to be able to evaluate the validity and reliability of these exams. Like we were talking about earlier, you want to be able to find documentation on the validity and the reliability or the standard error, depending on what aspects that you're looking at, and have documentation that the test is actually predicting what it is that you want to predict. That's one of the most important things, and we talked about being able to identify a certain job area or a certain profession, and we want to be able to make sure that this test predicts these types of skills, and these types of skills are important for this job. So when you're talking about just selecting the right test, these new tests that are going to be coming out, it's going to be important to evaluate that job market fit.
Thanks, Nathan. Shalini, can you please help the participants understand that what kind of psychometric assessments can be used for candidates who are unable to read? And if we were to conduct tests without contact in the COVID environment and the post-COVID environment, with people who may not have an access to technology, what can be the measures, and how can we conduct? What kind of tests can be conducted?
Sure. So I think this question is maybe more pertinent from an aptitude measurement perspective. And there are a lot of non-verbal reasoning tests which are available. Now, non-verbal reasoning is an umbrella term that covers a wide range of psychometric ability tests, such as inductive reasoning, logical reasoning, abstract reasoning, diagrammatic reasoning, and spatial reasoning. The term is used to indicate that verbal competency is not necessary or getting assessed by the test itself. So people who may not be able to read or write can still kind of attempt to do these tests. Some of these tests are also referred to as culture fair tests. Language is not really kind of involved in these tests. Now, nonverbal reasoning tests are used extensively in selection and assessment processes, as they don't really rely on specific language. And they can be a useful way of assessing a person's kind of raw ability rather than a learned skill, which could still be kind of language dependent, and along with language, say culture dependent. Now, one example of this is the Raven's progressive matrices, which is which is also called RPM, and it's an example of a well-established nonverbal group. Which is typically, this particular test is typically used more in educational settings. Now, examples of nonverbal tests are also seen in clinical settings for assessing personality through projective techniques such as the Rorschach ink block test or the thematic apperception test. Now, these tests can help to kind of understand a person's deep motivation or beliefs, attitudes, values. However, a high degree of training is really required to look at these kind of nonverbal tests. For the second part of your question, for people who may not have access to technology, the only way that I can really think of is more of a paper pen methodology, which I think we used to use in our college days when technology was not there. Then there were sort of, the way to really look at it was through a stencil, which would have all the answer options, etc. So that's the only thing I can think of. So either it's technology, either it's online, or it's a paper pencil method.
Great. And we'll keep exploring this question as we move forward in our discussion.
Sure.
Couple of our participants are from education industry. Rather, a lot of them are there from education industry, and they're quite keen to know what are the best practices for psychometric testing in schools, and what kind of tests can be used for school children. What is the effectiveness of these tests for teachers? Vishal, based on your experience with education industry, can you please share some insights?
So over a period of a decade or maybe a couple of decades, there has been a notable increase in popularity of psychometric testing, both in occupational and educational settings. So this increase in popularity has led to a proliferation of diverse psychometric tests, both nationally and internationally. What has happened with this has also led to a convergence in what can be seen as best practices or standards in psychometric testing. These standards highlights the importance of managing the testing process to ensure that the students, or maybe in educational domain, are effectively briefed about the strengths and the limitations of the test. And again, at the end of the test, maybe debriefed about the meaning of their scores. Now, this effective management of this testing process ensures that students are realistically can can realistically interpret the psychometric test, or maybe the test information, and are effectively prepared to look forward to use the results of this test in their future decisions. Now talking from the perspective of which kind of tests are more often used in this domain, I would say in India, per se, I can talk about the general ability test, which is categorized, like Shalini said earlier, like the verbal and non-verbal kind of test, where the aptitudes are measured and the interests are also measured from the personality perspective to guide the students for their career choices. In the clinical setting, there are a different set of tests which are used for diagnostic purposes and for the aspects of look forward for their developmental aspects in students. Psychoeducational is the right term that I would say comes into this picture. Yeah.
Thanks, Vishal. Nathan, would like to hear from you on the global perspective on this topic.
Okay, sure. I would divide it into two types of psychometric tests that are used in schools. There are curriculum-based and the non-curriculum-based. So the curriculum-based are the ones where you're measuring students' learning as measured by or compared to international, state, or national standards. That says a first grader needs to learn this in math, and a third grader needs to learn this in English, and so on. And those are the ones that provide the most direct feedback both to the student and to the teacher. And usually we call those formative assessments when it's just low stakes, providing information to the teacher and the student. And then there's summative assessments, which are higher stakes ones where the purpose is not to provide feedback to the student, but rather to the in an aggregate level, like to the state. Where you're trying to figure out, what are the best schools in a state, what are the worst schools that need help, and that sort of thing. And the tests that do that sort of work are very effective in being able to provide aggregate information. There's also the non-curriculum tests, which can kind of fall into the general, ability testing, like Dr. Vishal mentioned, as well as some other things. Some of the newer things that are there are social emotional learning, where you can test students on, psychological aspects of social emotional learning, being able to look at learning disabilities or other things that you might want to diagnose. And these are useful in a much different way because they're designed specifically to help individual students. So you can imagine, something like trying to diagnose learning disabilities. That's not something that's used, given to every student and then provides aggregate information across an entire state. That's something that we give to an individual student to determine, what are the learning disabilities they have? How can we provide an individual educational program, which is what we call it in the US, to help that specific student be the best that they can be. And psychometric tests are very useful in that situation.
Thanks, Nathan, for the insights. And yeah, I think it addresses the question that participants have posed before us. Overwhelming response from across 30 countries during registration makes me, take up this question where I would like to understand that how do we ensure that e-assessment testing in sub-Saharan Africa and small nations can work in the same way as it would work for a developed country? Which means that are these tests valid for the respective geographies as the available norms are from other countries? Nathan, would you like to take this question first?
Sure, thank you, Dr. Sharma. The important thing to remember here that was mentioned earlier, I think by Dr. Duggal, was being able to compare the situation of your intended use of the test to the original normative or validation sample, both in terms of the type of people that are being used and the type of job or situation that the test is being used. And in a lot of cases, the validity does transfer quite well. You can imagine if we're talking about, a quantitative skills test used in bookkeeping and accounting or something like that that's being used to hire people. A test like that would transfer very well between different companies because quantitative reasoning is something that doesn't change very much between countries. On the other hand, if it was looking at accounting, which is very related to law, that's going to change quite substantially between countries. It also depends upon the use of the test. Like if the purpose of the test is just to identify, let's say, the top 10% of applicants, being used on a different situation than its normative sample might not be that large of a deal, because the purpose is not to compare your sample, let's say in Burundi, to a sample in India. You're just trying to figure out who are the top 10% in Burundi. And that's a very different question than trying to compare your results to results from a different country. And then perhaps really then what you're doing is using your own sample as the normative sample then, because you're trying to figure out who are the top 10% in Burundi. So this can be quite feasible. You might run into a larger hurdle if you're talking about criterion reference testing. So norm reference testing is where you're comparing people to other people. Criterion reference testing is where you're comparing people's scores to some sort of subjective or objective benchmark. So like if you're taking a test to become certified as an accountant, it doesn't matter how well other people taking the test are doing, or whether you're in the 10% or the top 50%, there's going to be some sort of objective cut score that says, if you get above this score, you are certified as an accountant in this country. And taking those kind of cut scores and transferring them across boundaries, that can be very problematic. And you might need to reset cut scores for certain situations as you go to different countries.
I totally agree with you, Nathan. Thanks for sharing this. Vishal, what's your take on this?
So apart from what Nathan has focused upon, I would also try to bring your attention towards the feasibility or the penetration of these assessments in smaller nations and sub-Sahara area. And the e-assessment, or what we can encourage is the cloud-based platforms, or maybe the computer-based assessments in these nations can aid to the penetration. So what I can say is like the efforts done by International Test Commission or certain organizations to encourage organizations from across the developing world to come up with the adapting the assessments for selection and maybe training purposes of their employees is critical. And I suppose the technology brings us to a very important aspect of utility of these assessments in smaller nations and Sub-Sahara Africa. Yeah.
Thanks, Vishal. I think this was quite an insightful sharing for the participants, and I'm sure this conversation will help organizations take more meaningful and data-driven decisions. A burning question or a concern that most of the HR fraternity would have is that in the current scenario with budget constraints in most of the organizations, how can we push the relevance and execution of psychometric tests in aspects of HR? So Shalini, would you like to take this question?
Sure, Dr. Sharma. So I think maybe a different question that we could ask in this situation is that, what value do psychometric tests really contribute to the purpose for which they're being used? So what value do they really kind of bring to the table? And then post that, look at it from a cost benefit analysis perspective. So, cost and value are both relative terms. In case where, we are doing mass level hiring, which should hopefully kind of pick up soon or may already be happening in some sectors, psychometric tools can be an effective screening instrument, which in itself helps save a lot of money in terms of interviewer time and effort, and also provides a more consistent outcome. So in that sense, when we look at the cost and value offered, it kind of sort of builds from that perspective. Similarly, say in senior level hiring or selections, psychometric tools can provide valuable insights, which are then validated through interviews. This can also lend to reducing the adverse impact through wrong selection, which could the cost of which could be significantly higher than the cost of the psychometric tool. For any kind of a development intervention in the organization, a psychometric tool, when combined with the intervention itself, say such as coaching or even when used as a pre-assessment to training, it can really amplify the outcomes derived from the development intervention itself. So it makes the development intervention more specific and more meaningful to the individual's unique needs. So I think it's really about perspective here. It's about positioning. It's about the perceived value. That's what it really boils down to, you know, both in terms of the cost aspect and the benefit aspect. So it's really about what kind of value is really perceived through the in that particular setting. But having said that, I'm sure at this point there are a lot of discounted deals on the table which are being offered. If you know, somebody was to do their research, I'm sure they'll get a good deal.
Okay. Thanks, Shalini.
Sure.
Vishal, a lot of our audience would like to know that how can we convince the management to start using psychometric assessments in a tight budget?
I second the opinion of Shalini. It's like the cost-benefit ratio that comes into picture. And I believe a lot of things have come to table in the COVID situation that has led to, you know, discounted things. But I believe truly that the benefit arising out of deployment of psychometric assessments in recruitment process, or maybe large-scale recruitment, or maybe for that matter training need analysis, gives you a better you know, benefit. The reason is you know, the per hire cost, or maybe the aspect of, like, you know, the prospect of hiring a bad you know, employee during in a process leads to much more losses than what we can find in using of psychometric test. That gives you an edge of informed decision, informed choice, and that is very much in accordance with what the company would look for, or the organization would look for the benefit of the organization. So that is the only one of the important aspect that it brings to you. It curtails your you know, the ability to chances of getting a bad hire, and then enhances the probability of leading you to a better choice in terms of the recruitment process. Yeah.
Thanks, Vishal, and I hope this addresses the question. The next question is one of my favorite ones. What are the new directions for psychometric testing? Who would like to address this?
May I go in first?
Oh, sure. Yeah, please go.
So, given a chance, I was able to work with the organization sometime earlier to introduce the gamified approach, or maybe the VR-related aspects into psychometric assessments, and this was a very new avenue to the core subject. Since the entire the background to it differs, game-based assessments, or maybe gamified assessments, are much more you know, engaging to the employee, or maybe for that matter for the individual. And the traditional practices, if the concepts of the traditional practices, or maybe the accuracy levels, or maybe the aspects of standardizations adopted in a very rigid manner to these new aspects like game-based assessments, or maybe the chatbot type of assessments that maybe Shalini you would like to, you know, throw some light on. I believe that engages the new generation of employees, or maybe individuals, much more in terms of the assessments adopted across the organizations. So the significant shift from paper pencil based assessments to computer based assessments to infinite based assessment. Now we are looking to a future which has got a kind of game based assessment, or a gamified approach towards assessment. So that gives a very strong edge to technology in terms of psychometric assessments to be, you know, effective. Yeah.
Thanks, Vishal. Nathan, your perspective on this?
Sure, thank you. My perspective on the gamified assessments and other new areas is just to be careful and not make the new assessment about the technology, but rather have it be driven by validity. And that's something I've seen happen, is where organizations get some idea about having, you know, new technology they want to use, or they come up with some new question type and so on, but it's not grounded in the actual reliability and validity of the exam. And I've seen these types of new assessments or new question types crash and burn because of that. But nevertheless, there are still a number of very good advancements that are being made in this area, and there are huge benefits to be able to do gamified assessments or other modernized assessments. One that I worked with in a past project was they were making job skills tests for people that work in eye doctor offices. And the traditional way to make those tests, you had a written test, but then you also had performance tests, and they would make people fly into central areas, like once a year, and they would have to do the tasks while a doctor was sitting there watching them. And of course, this became very expensive and very time consuming because you're having people fly into a central location and have a doctor watch them do that. Eventually, they made those into gamified assessments because you can turn this kind of thing into some sort of, it doesn't even require virtual reality. It just essentially makes it a game on your computer where you're turning dials and, putting glasses into a lensometer, making sure that you can measure, use these different types of tools correctly. And it doesn't require a person to fly, 1,000 kilometers to show that they can use some of these tools correctly when the tool can be easily approximated on a computer screen. And in cases like that, these can provide huge additions to an organization. We were just talking about cost-benefit analysis. Something like that, yeah, you're developing, you have to invest money to make this into a gamified assessment. But if you're talking about saving, hundreds of people flying across the country every year, the savings are recouped in the first year. And it was very, very positive for that organization.
Thanks, Nathan. And I'm really looking forward to some exciting research and innovations in the field of psychometrics with this. My experience in assessment designing, based on that, I can say that there is definitely a willingness to try out new and varied forms of psychometric assessments, including game-based assessments or chatbot-enabled assessments or gamified assessments. However, most of the companies currently are focusing on the cognitive aspects and not the non-cognitive aspects, which is personality, emotional intelligence, or ability to handle different situations. I think there are companies really need to innovate robust ways to design such personality assessments in form of games, which can be a path-breaking solution. I'm aware of a lot of companies, and I've been advising also a couple of companies who have invested in development of such assessments, and I think the future is quite promising for them. Yeah. Great. So moving on to our closing question, because we already are on 6:54 India time. Moving on to our closing question, which is like, how best can we utilize a psychometric assessment and how not to misuse a psychometric assessment? Nathan, would you like to address this through some supporting researches in the field?
Sure. One of the key research topics, if you're looking for this, is validity generalization, which is different than generalizability theory, those of you who have seen that. So validity generalization is talking about how can you take a psychometric test and use it in other areas and make sure that it's not being misused. So it does a general ability test work for these types of job families, but does not work for these types of job families. And there's substantial research that shows that there is quite large generalizability, and, because a general ability test or a quantitative reasoning test, you can imagine that these provide information across a wide range of job families. On the other hand, there are some psychometric tests that are very specific that don't have much generalizability. The non-cognitive ones that she mentioned are one case that do have substantial generalizability, because if you're talking about having skills like resilience or conscientiousness or good attention span or things like that, those apply to a very, very wide range. I mean, we're not just talking about quantitative ability here, but talking about, you need those kinds of skills for every job. And those provide what we call incremental validity across the cognitive measures. So usually, we generally think about psychometric tests of being some sort of cognitive measure, whether it's general ability or quantitative ability or computer skills or coding skills or something specific and cognitive to the job that we're talking about. But having things like conscientiousness or ability to work from home, these are more general types of constructs that are non-cognitive. But not only do they provide information across a wide range of job families, they will often provide incremental ability or predictiveness that's above those cognitive exams that we usually think of. And that's one of the newer areas of assessment. even in the K-12 world, the whole idea of social emotional learning has only been around for maybe 5 or 10 years, and they have tests there that are essentially doing the same thing of providing non-cognitive assessments, provide incremental validity over the cognitive.
अरे तो वो करो, कोई जानता ही नहीं कब
Thanks,
बोलेगा.
Nathan. Shalini would love to know your opinion on this based on your experience so far.
Sure, Dr. Sharma. So I think it's important to keep in mind the purpose for which the psychometric tool is being used and how much value does it contribute to the outcome. So it's important to keep in mind the skills that are getting assessed and what are the decisions that hope to be made with the answers that the test provides. Now, a psychometric tool can provide many meaningful insights into a person from both a selection and a development perspective. There are two things that need to be kept in mind. One is the tool itself. So, a well-researched, validated, and relevant tool can add a lot of meaning to decisions. It's important to choose a tool that helps serve this purpose. So a good starting point is to really establish what are we trying to assess as a first step. So what are the skills, both in terms of functional skills, behavioral skills that we are trying to assess? Basically it boils down to what is really needed to do the job well. For example, say for a sales role, say for negotiation skills, that may be important. Interpersonal skills may be important, or sales planning may be important from a behavioral and a functional skills perspective. So these need to be captured well. They should be kind of, ideally through a job analysis and sort of defined so as to, kind of define the scope of the test or the scope of the interpretation of the scores itself. And then select a tool that is aligned, to these aspects. Also to be kept in mind are of course the reliability and validity aspects in relation to these aspects, according to what we discussed earlier in the webinar today. Now the second is, the person using the test or the user who will be kind of interpreting the scores. Do they know how to derive the maximum meaning from the test? And this is where training becomes important, either from a generic psychometric perspective or training on the test itself. Now the test may be great, it may be well researched, it may be well suited, it may be well defined and all of that. But if the user doesn't know how to apply it or to interpret it, then it's really of no benefit. So that really becomes very vital. So both the aspects, the tool, statistical qualities, as well as user training are significant to ensure that the tool is utilized properly.
Thanks, Shalini, and I thank you all the speakers here for sharing their valuable insight. Since we are almost close to the time, I think we can take a couple of questions from the audience, and rest of the questions we can address it over the mail. I think post the webinar, Akshay from IIBP will be sharing the video or the recording of this webinar with all the participants who are registered, and can also share the questions with all the speakers to be addressed over the mail. Maybe you can also share our email ID. So if somebody has a specific question for a specific speaker or for me, they can reach out to us. Maybe Akshay, can we take 5 minutes to address 2-3 questions? We can take up 2-3 questions, right?
Sure, absolutely, ma'am.
Sure. So just allow me a minute. Okay, so one of the questions is that what are the most challenging issues in psychometric testing during COVID are to validate the real participants and to protect an item exposure, especially for high-stake tests such as employee recruitment. What can be some of the best practices to overcome these particular issues? Please share if you have a case study regarding the situation. Who would like to take up this question?
I can provide an answer to that.
Sure.
Okay, there's a couple of approaches that can help battle item exposure. One is to use algorithmic test delivery. You heard me mention earlier your computerized adaptive testing. Computerized adaptive testing gives everyone their own personalized exam, and on top of that, there are sub-algorithms that control item exposure. There's also something called linear on-the-fly testing, where everybody gets their own randomly generated exam, but still meant to be 100% equivalent with everybody else's. Plus, you also might want to look into new technologies for automated item generation. Excuse me. And they help you create what's called item isomorphs. So an item isomorph is where you take items and slightly change them so that they can provide the same information. You're still testing the same thing, but you're going to replace numbers or an example or a vignette or something like that. And doing this allows you to build your item bank to be much larger with minimal effort, and therefore helps you be able to maintain acceptable levels of item exposure.
Thanks, Nathan. Another question is around what is the importance of computerized adaptive testing in psychometric process? So would like to address this.
I can do that one too. So adaptive testing is one of the areas I do most of my work in. And basically what all research has boiled down to over the past 40, 50 years is an adaptive test can produce a score that is just as accurate with half as many items or even less. I worked on a project once where they reduced the test length by 90%. And this was on a psychometric test for mood disorders used in the psychiatric area. So that they can show by looking at the reliability and other statistical aspects that they don't get any loss of accuracy, but have a much shorter test, which makes a small difference for an individual person. But if you're testing, 1,000 people or 100,000 people, that's, extra half hour that you saved or whatever it is adds up substantially and can make very large savings for an organization.
Thanks, Nathan. I think one last question due to the constraint of time. Can we then regard curriculum-based assessment as norm reference while that of the high stakes as criterion reference? Vishal, would you like to take this question? Shall I repeat the question, Vishal, for you? Yeah, so it is a follow-up question to computerized adaptive testing, the importance of computerized adaptive testing. Can we then regard curriculum-based assessment as a norm reference, while that of high stakes as criterion reference?
So I suppose that is curriculum-based assessments are again, as pointed out by Nathan, they are formative type of assessments, and they provide particular insight to the user, either the teacher or maybe the student, in terms of like what you can do. And criterion, the norm referenced is one of the aspects that can be related to. You asked the criterion reference, yes, that can be related to this kind of formative type of assessments, which can be used. And I suppose more insights can come through Nathan in that context.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Vishal. Yeah, I would say that curriculum-based assessments can be used in both norm referenced ways and criterion referenced ways. So a norm referenced way is, telling you where you stand versus the other students in your class. That can be useful information. It can also be used criterion referenced way, saying that, okay, 7th graders are supposed to learn these 26 standards in mathematics, and you have mastered 17 of the 26 standards. That's a criterion reference interpretation that also provides very useful information to you as a student.